Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to part 4 of our Chapter 4 lecture series, this one entitled The Public Sphere. The focus question for this section is, what concepts and institutions dominated colonial politics in the 18th century? The right to vote was a central tenet of republicanism, so as civic participation increased exponentially in 18th century British North America, the right to vote became more and more important to social and political life in the colonies. Now, suffrage requirements varied between the colonies, but nearly all of them had some sort of property qualification attached to voting privileges. And this went back to those ideas of civic virtue and the idea that only economically independent citizens had the right to participate in Republican government. Now, a larger percentage of men in colonial America actually voted than did in Britain, basically because a higher percentage of the population actually owned property. Marginalized groups were generally prohibited from voting, and this included African Americans and women, although that too did vary from place to place and from time to time. There were places and at certain times when free blacks could vote in some elections, and also some occasions when women were allowed to vote, especially in the early colonial period, and even up to 1807 in New Jersey, they still allowed women to vote in that state by that time up until then. The political cultures of colonial America were quite different from the political culture that we understand today. Strongly competitive elections like those that we are used to only really occurred in the middle colonies. Campaigning for office in all other colonies was seen as beneath the status of a gentleman. They thought that each individual candidate's reputation and virtue alone sufficed for candidacy, that their name should appear on the ballot, and their mere reputation amongst the populace was enough for people to be able to judge them worthy or not for election to whatever office that they sought. Considerable power was also held in appointive, not elective office, particularly in the office of governor in most of the colonies by the mid-18th century. Property qualification requirement was much higher for office holding than it actually was for voting, which ensured that only the elites, those who qualified as gentlemen, would be able to stand for elective position. There was also a tradition of deference to those higher in the social hierarchy by those underneath them in that hierarchy. Wealth, education, social prominence, and economic success, of course, in business was considered hallmarks of a gentleman and signposts that that person was capable and ready to govern as was needed in a republican society. Colonial government in British North America became increasingly more robust in the 18th century. For a while up to that point, the British had practiced an unofficial policy that historians have termed salutary neglect in their dealings with the North American colonies. The British were preoccupied for much of that time with events in Europe and elsewhere in their growing global empire. So the British essentially allowed the American colonies to mostly govern themselves. The assemblies created their own laws, and colonists ignored British laws they did not like. And for the most part, the British failed through either negligence or just not caring that much to enforce a lot of those laws as well. Now, this period saw the rise of colonial assemblies to greater and greater authority in British colonial life. The assemblies became increasingly more assertive in pressing for their rights and privileges as the 18th century progressed. They grew in power and influence in relation to the royally appointed officials by the king and the parliament in Britain, particularly the royally appointed governors in most of those colonies. And there was constant tensions and conflicts between royal governors and colonial assemblies as each tried to vie with one another for authority over the management and government of the colonies. Increasingly, colonial Americans felt that not only could they govern themselves, but they should govern themselves. Coinciding with and reinforcing the rise of colonial assemblies in 18th century British North America was the expansion of the public sphere. As more people became interested and involved in government and politics, what constituted the public sphere, or that sphere of issues that the public had a right to weigh in on, to voice their opinion on, grew larger and larger as this process unfolded. Political clubs were formed that provided avenues and platforms for discussion and debate of events and political manipulations and dealings. And taverns quickly became prominent public gathering places where news and opinions were shared amongst the populace of the colonies. Also reinforcing this expansion of interest in politics in the public sphere was the expansion of the colonial press. The printing press by the mid-18th century was widespread throughout most of the colonies, and there was also widespread literacy throughout the colonies that was a relic of that Protestant belief in individual interpretation of the Bible, which led to most Protestants learning to read so they too could interpret the Bible for themselves. The political press was ever increasing as the 18th century progressed and printed out a whole plethora of broadsides, pamphlets, and newspapers that an ever-interested public ate up voraciously. Also, this time saw the establishment of some of the first libraries in North America, with the first one actually established by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia in the early 18th century. Ideas of free speech increasingly came up for debate in 18th century British North America. It must be understood that prior to this period, free speech was not a right that was understood to be protected for the people. There were limits placed on free speech. Outside of the walls of Parliament, free speech was not legally protected. Inside of Parliament, free speech was thought of as necessary for open and honest debate. However, outside of that, it was still considered potentially treasonous or seditious or provoking discord or dissent. Freedom of the press was seen as dangerous and actually often prosecuted under colonial law. All of this began to change in the 18th century as liberal ideas of individual rights became more and more associated with ideas of free speech. One of the early testing grounds for these new ideas of free speech and freedom of the press was the trial of John Peter Zenger in New York in the colonial period. John Peter Zenger published a newspaper that criticized the royal governor of New York and was actually put on trial for seditious libel. And he was found not guilty. And the discussion of the trial in the press began really popularizing ideas of the free press and freedom of expression that would become increasingly important as not only privileges but rights in the later 18th century. all of these new ideas of republicanism and liberalism and individual rights were all born out of a movement known as the Enlightenment. This movement began in Europe in the late 17th century but reached a peak in the mid 18th century. The thinkers of this movement, primarily from France and Britain, particularly Scotland, sought to apply the scientific method to political and social life as well. And it was really a reaction against the religious wars in Europe of the previous century, particularly the 30 Years' War, which occurred between 1618 and 1648, which pitted Protestants against Catholics and arguably was the bloodiest war in European history prior to World War I. The Enlightenment thinkers thought that human societies could be understood through reason and logic, that no longer should religious ideals govern mankind, but mankind could reasonably and logically think through how to move in the world on their own without some overarching God in control of them or their freedoms or etc. This also coincided with a movement that was particularly prominent among some of the elites in North America, known as deism, which was a Christian-based belief, but essentially this idea of what is known as a clockwork God, a deity that basically creates things, sets everything in motion, and then pulls back and lets things play out however they will and has no direct involvement in the day-to-day affairs of mankind. That, in the Enlightenment period, became more and more associated with man and less with God. That man should manage its own day-to-day affairs and was responsible for himself in the world. That concludes part 4 of our chapter 4 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.